the Harvard Club of New York. And in this special occasion also, as it is a joint program on behalf of the Harvard Divinity School's Business and Religious Tradition program, as well as the Harvard Business School Club of New York. The idea of the Business and Religious Tradition program was in fact inspired by one of our club members, Bruce McEver, who is also your host tonight. The Harvard Club has asked me to invite you to its website to complete a survey called Vision 2020 to give feedback and ideas about programs for into the future. And now I would like to tell you how privileged we are to have someone in addition to those who are on the program, which is Professor William Graham of the Harvard Divinity School, who will be introducing the conversation tonight. Professor Graham has many awards in Middle Eastern studies and has published many books, and it would be fun just to go through his full biography for the evening. He became the dean of the faculty of the Harvard Divinity School in 2002 and has been on the faculty since 1973 and written very widely, including an intriguing book, Three Faiths, One God. Dean Graham, welcome. We're looking forward to this tonight.
Thank you very much. I won't stand long between you and the program that I know you've all come for, but it is a great pleasure for me to be able to welcome everyone on behalf of the Divinity School. And I'd like to thank the Harvard Club of New York City for sponsoring this event as well. I think this is a wonderful opportunity. And of course, the Harvard Business School Club, in particular Richard Kane, who's club president, and Barbara Morrow, whom you've heard from, the joint program coordinator, for making this possible tonight. It's a great pleasure tonight, as I know, because we have such a tremendously wonderful crowd tonight. I think that Barbara and all of us feel that we haven't seen a crowd like this in a long time for any of these events. And I know that it's due to our guest tonight, Stephen Green, and I welcome him here as well. And I want to thank you, particularly Stephen, for being willing to come and join us and be here to talk to everyone this evening. Bruce McEver, who's already been mentioned, is known to many of you here in the audience, both the business school and the divinity side of things, and it was his generous donation that's actually made the programming such as this possible. And I'm always grateful to Bruce both for his presence and his friendship and for his support and his ideas for having events like this. And finally, I'll turn to the chief reason that I'm up here, which is to introduce Ronald F. Thiemann, who is the Bussey Professor of Theology at the Divinity School. The Bussey Professorship is the oldest endowed chair in theology at Harvard University. Ron has been at Harvard since 1986, when he came from Haverford College to serve as Dean of the Divinity School, which he did for 12 years from 1986. He's a faculty associate currently of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs in Arts and Sciences, and is also affiliated with the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. A specialist on the role of religion in public life, Ronald Thiemann is the author of Religion in Public Life, A Dilemma for Democracy, and of Constructing a Public Theology, the Church in a Pluralistic Culture. These are two of his several books. Another that he has edited and also contributed to is Who Will Provide? The Changing Role of Religion in American Social Welfare. He's currently working on a book-length project entitled Sacramental Realism, Literary Art as Social Criticism. In 2006, he represented the U.S. National Academies of Science on a lecture tour of universities and research centers in the Islamic Republic of Iran. This fall, he was named the North American representative to the Lutheran Roman Catholic Commission on Unity, and I can tell you he's holding up the Lutheran side of that discussion. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Ron to the podium, who will introduce our speaker of this evening. Ron will also be the respondent to Stephen Green's remarks. So Ron, please.
Thanks so much, Bill. And I simply want to add my words of welcome. Such a wonderful turnout. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Stephen Green. As many of you know, this Business Across Religious Traditions program is now in its 5th year, and our goal is to provide a variety of educational initiatives which would help leaders to understand the place of religion in global societies, with our hope of increasing religious literacy and interreligious understanding. Most of our programming has been held here at the New York Harvard Club, but we've also held programs in San Francisco and in Boston and in London. Tonight, though, we are launching a new initiative, the CEO Lecture on Faith, Ethics, and Leadership, and we are delighted to welcome as our inaugural speaker, Mr. Stephen Green, former CEO and current group chairman of HSBC, and beginning early in 2011, the new Minister of State for Trade and Investment in the United Kingdom. Stephen Green is a singular figure in the world of banking, the only chairman of a major international bank who was also an ordained priest in the Church of England. He attended Exeter College, Oxford, where he received his degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. And in addition to his formal theological training, he also holds a master's degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Following his graduation from Oxford, he worked for a year in a halfway house for recovering alcoholics, and then moved on to become a consultant for McKinsey in Europe, North America, and the Middle East. He joined HSBC in 1983 and rose through the ranks, being named CEO in 2003 and group chairman in 2006, the year he also became chairman of the British Bankers Association. Mr. Green is the author of 2 best-selling books, both of which combine his expertise in religion, ethics, and business. Serving God, Serving Mammon, published in 1996, and his 2010 volume, Good Value: Reflections on Money, Morality, and an Uncertain World. In prose at once elegant and accessible, his reflections in these books are thoughtful, critical, realistic, and yet in the end, hopeful. I think you'll agree that he is the perfect choice to launch this new series on faith, ethics, and leadership. Mr. Stephen Green.
Ron, thank you very much for those far too kind words of introduction. It's a great pleasure great honor to be here in this extremely distinguished hall. Can banking be described as doing God's work? Your reaction as I say that reflects the reaction of many, the chorus of incredulity and even derision, certainly cynicism, and maybe that's understandable given everything that's happened in the last 2 to 3 years. As the British historian Niall Ferguson, who's now the William Ziegler Professor at Harvard Business School, he put it, banking has never looked less like a divine calling. The intersection of faith and finance is certainly complex. There is a fundamental question on the ethics of money which underlines any discussion of the relationship, and it's a question which has been asked down the ages. Each of the major monotheistic religions addresses the interaction of faith and finance in its holy texts. The Gospel of St. Matthew, for example, as we all know, well, as many of us know, I hope, has Jesus in the temple overthrowing the tables of the money changers and the seats of those that sold doves. Although it's also the case that Luke's Gospel has the parable of the talents, which is the only place in the Bible that I'm aware of where bankers are mentioned, and that in entirely neutral terms. There's the second chapter of the Quran, which says those who charge usury are in the same position as those who are controlled by the devil's influence. And just for good measure, the Talmud, drawing on Ezekiel, has the following damning accusation: he who has lent on usury, he who has taken interest, he shall surely not live, having done all these abominations. I could add some rather less metaphysical or theistic comments from Confucius of a not completely dissimilar kind. And these quotes demonstrate a profound and long-standing suspicion of finance that lies deep within our cultural psyche around the world. Indeed, there are still laws on usury on the statute books of some US states. And of course, the events of recent years have done nothing to allay the unease. It is clear that today's financial industry reputation has been severely damaged by the crisis, to say the least, and this was in part due to the very type of short-term greed that those texts from various sacred scriptures warn against. However, I do firmly believe, and I don't think I'm alone in this, that it is possible to take an ethical approach to banking, and indeed, more than that it is absolutely necessary to do so, since we cannot do without it. And this is the core of the argument that I'm going to be developing over the next few minutes. More broadly, there is a powerful case to argue that businesses in general, which are enlightened, which are led by their values, and which look to long-term prosperity rather than short-term gain, are not merely a significant force for good in society, but are actually essential to the good of society. So what does this mean for the companies that make up the global economy, for our capitalist system, and indeed for each of us as individuals? These are the questions that I want to reflect on this evening. But first, I think it's important to consider this in the broader context within which we are all living out our lives in this extraordinary 21st century. Because, and I know this is a bit of a cliche, but it is actually worth repeating it, this is a time of huge, rapid, seismic change. First, the global center of economic gravity is moving from the west to the east. It is the great fact about the first half of the 21st century. Asia's share of global GDP is still only slightly above 30%, yet it will account for probably no less than about 60% of global growth this year. In recent weeks, China has taken its place finally as the world's second largest economy. And it does look on track to overtake in absolute size the US and become the largest economy in the world, possibly as soon as the end of this decade. Over the next 5 years, China's middle class is expected to almost double from around 170 million now to over 300 million, which is, if you think about it, more than the entire US population. Many people question the sustainability of this. My view is that emerging markets in general, China in particular, but emerging markets more generally, will continue to lead global growth for the foreseeable future, and this is having an effect on the whole balance of global economic power. This does have clear implications for the global economic and political stage. It is becoming clear that we're moving away from a unipolar system that we've enjoyed in actually not terribly long, I'd argue only since 1989, and returning to what is actually historically more normal, a multipolar balance of power. Indeed, I would argue that history has seen only two short intervals when there was genuinely a single global superpower. One of them lasted from 1815 to 1871, the fall of Napoleonic France, to the unification of Germany, and in a brief period in between, Britain was the global superpower. One of them started in 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union and may be ending about now. The clearest sign of this is the growing importance of the G20. Indeed, I think that the rise of this forum as the central body for debating the world's economic affairs is hugely significant. I think that historians writing in, say, 50 or maybe 100 years' time and looking back on this period will point to that as the moment when the international community began facing up to a complex and in some ways uncomfortable reality, and gave up the notion that a group of rich nations could get together and sort out the world's problems. Or to put it more in headline terms, the G7 has been marginalized. This points me on to the second major global trend, which is changing the face of the world almost as we live. And that is the very fact of urbanization per se. In the year 2008, we reached a historic moment in the history of humanity when, for the first time, more than half the world's population lived in big cities. And of course, the story of urbanization is no longer really about Western cities. Today, more than a third of the world's population live in emerging market cities. That proportion may rise to 60 or 70 or even 80% in the next half century or so. It is those cities in which virtually all future population growth will take place, and indeed a large proportion of future economic growth too. It's worth reflecting for a moment that in addition to having more than 40 cities with over 1 million inhabitants already, China has a further 700 rapidly growing cities, each of which are already home to more than 500,000 people. And this is in a country which is only at most halfway through the great social transformation of urbanization, the huge numbers of people moving from the rural economy to the urban economy. Everything in China is, of course, on a huge scale. The actual direction of that is, however, nothing other than what the Europeans did in the 19th century, America did in this century, in the 20th century, and so did Russia, albeit in obviously rather different ways. The cities that I'm talking about have names that very few of us would even recognize, and it's not just China. The same thing is true of, for example, India, but also of many other emerging countries. The third big characteristic of the modern era is, of course, one which we talk a lot about, but it doesn't get less true for being talked about, namely the digitalization of the world and also the people movement of the world. Maybe that gets rather less talked about. But we all know what I mean when we say that the digital world is connecting people up more and more. Perhaps what we less often recognize is the way in which people movement is changing the way the world works. We, at my bank where I work, reckon that there are probably now 200 million people in the world who work somewhere else than where they were born and where they expect to live out their longer-term lives. These are all sorts of people, from migrant workers through company executives being transferred, and you see the results in so many of the cities that we take for granted, including, of course, this one, but also the city where I live, London, where there are more than 300 languages spoken in the city every single day, and where there are more than 30 different linguistic groups that have more than 10,000 people in them. This is an extraordinary phenomenon of recent times. New cities, the movement of people, the rise of technology. The general question that this poses is, what does it do to all of us? And the thing is that whilst things are going well, whilst you're living in boom times in the global economy, you don't stop to answer that question. You don't stop to reflect about it perhaps enough. We all in the go-go years in the first part of this decade were very busy. Things seem to be going very well. Lots and lots of people seem to be getting more and more affluent. Affluence seems to be spreading through societies, both developed countries and developing countries. No one stops to ask, what are these fundamental changes doing to all of us? One of the characteristics of a major financial and economic crisis that we have now been living through is that those questions are suddenly pushed to the forefront. There is renewed anxiety everywhere, in so many countries in the world. There is a big breakdown of trust in so many of the institutions that used to be respected. in many countries around the world, whether you're talking about businesses, whether you're talking about official institutions, public institutions, frankly, whether you're even talking about churches, there's been a breakdown of trust. And at the same time, the longer term issues which are there when we stop to think about them, issues about, for example, the maldistribution of global income and the still pervasive extent of real poverty, or the whole issue of the exploitation of the planet and its durability and the impact of economic development and demographic growth, these issues are still there, and they come to the fore as part of this real questioning which is triggered by a financial crisis. In a sense, you could say that the whole mode of life that we have lived with, at least since 1989, the capitalist, market fundamentalist life, is in the dock for the first time for a generation. So let me reflect a little bit on the nature of that capitalist world, to use the short term, the shorthand for it, that we've been living in. And I'd like to think just a little bit about the changing nature of capitalism, firstly. From its raw beginnings in the kilns and furnaces of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, capitalism, you might say, has come a long way when you think about it. William Thackeray was the person who appears to have first coined the term, at least as far as the English language is concerned, around 150 years ago. Since then, many people have argued that it served the elite very well, but served the broad mass of the population rather less well. As Dickens put it, many were the slaves of an iron-handed and grinding despotism. But then came the 20th century and capitalism changed. It changed for a whole series of reasons, or evolved, perhaps is a better term, for reasons I don't have time to go into fully this evening. The arteries of finance and trade were severed first by conflicts in the shape of the First World War, and then by the collapse of activity in the 1930s, and capitalism came close to death. Depression led to fascism, fascism led to war, and yet from the depths came hope. A war-weary desire for a better world after the Second World War saw capitalism become, perhaps for the first time, a force not just of economic growth, but actually of rapid social development as well. And thrown into a struggle against the other great system of the 20th century, that of communism, it emerged dominant in the end. And now, in the wake of the worst financial crisis since those 1930s and the first synchronized global downturn, we find ourselves at the beginning of the 21st century with capitalism unopposed and yet under more scrutiny than it has been in any of our lifetimes. So what was it that went wrong? It's perhaps no coincidence that as the Cold War ended, capitalism started to overheat. When two opposing forces are pushing against each other for so long, it may be perhaps inevitable in human terms that the removal of one of them should lead the other to get out of control. Capitalism's success, its success in showing communism for what it was, gave rise to a sort of hubris, to a sort of complacency, to a complacency that became almost what you might describe as a fundamentalist faith in the market. The goal of social and economic development gave way to the naked pursuit of short-term profit without any other reference to social impact. You could tell all sorts of anecdotes to illustrate this point. I've got one simple one which concerns a British company, a company now defunct, but in its time was one of the great names of British commerce and industry. It was a British company in the chemical industry. And it set out in the mid-1980s a mission statement in its annual report. In that statement, it said that its goal was, quotes, to be the world's leading chemical company, serving customers internationally through the innovative and responsible application of chemistry and related science. Through the achievement of our aim, we will enhance the wealth and well-being of our shareholders, our employees, our customers, and the communities in which we serve and where we operate. In the 1990s, that same company described its objectives in a rather different way. It described its sole objective as being, quotes again, to maximize value for our shareholders by focusing on businesses where we have market leadership, a technological edge, and a well-competitive cost base. You can see the shift of focus, I hope, in that 10-year gap between the mid-1980s and the mid-1990s. The company I'm talking about was ICI. But this thinking pervaded more than just one corporate board room. Something profoundly significant had changed in those intervening years, and it went on, and we can all name other examples of spectacular corporate failures that resulted from a very short-termist, and indeed in some cases fraudulent, of course, pursuit of the financial short-term gain. What was involved was a significant shift in the philosophy of business and in some ways actually the underlying philosophy or mores of the whole of society. A shift which led like an arrow to the problems that we're living through today. And yet, this crisis, though massive in its scope and its scale, has not delivered, I believe, anything like a fatal blow to the capitalist system. The system, flawed as it is, survives. Why is this the case? Well, I think there are a couple of quite important reasons for that. The firstly is that the response to the crisis has so far been effective. It is the case, and historians of 50 or 100 years hence will note this, that intergovernmental cooperation in 2008-09 was successful in staving off a world depression. We had a world recession. We did not have a world depression. And those historians writing in future generations will, I believe, contrast the period of the 1930s and the first decade of this century, when almost every conceivable measure was taken in the wrong direction in the 30s, and now, by and large, so far at least, largely the international community got it right. There are still plenty of questions, of course, about what next. And next week, the G20 meets in Seoul to discuss what are the next stages in the repair and reform of financial systems and economic systems globally. There are plenty of questions on the agenda, and nevertheless, I think it is worth recognizing what has been achieved to date. Indeed, when the G20 met last year in London, April 2009, there's a very interesting statement that it issued at the start of its communiqué. Again, one that I think the future historians will notice. They said, "We believe that the only sure foundation for sustainable globalization and rising prosperity for all is an open world economy based on market principles, effective regulation, and strong global institutions." It's a remarkable statement, not least because it bore the signatures of the President of the United States, the President of the Russian Federation, the President of the People's Republic of China, the King of Saudi Arabia, and 16 other leaders whose economies collectively accounted for over 80% of world output. And if you think of just about those 4 countries that I've mentioned, just how different they are in so many ways, and yet the world did in fact come together on a statement of philosophy about how economic and social development ought to run. All sorts of questions begged, yes, of course. Nevertheless, let's recognize this as a mark of some human progress, and certainly if you compare it with the 1930s. This brings me to the second reason why I think the future of capitalism is in fact secure, and namely that there is no acceptable alternative. That is, after all, the stark lesson, surely, of the 20th century. I can't, as a Brit, stand here without quoting Sir Winston Churchill, because that's what we always do. He famously said, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all of those other forms that have been tried from time to time." And I think that we should now invoke that Churchillian defense on behalf of capitalism. You might say of the markets that they're the worst system of economic and social development except for all of the others that have been tried from time to time, and we do know from the 20th century what the other ones are like. But this is not, to be clear, an argument for complacency or for the status quo. It is clear that capitalism has been found wanting and that will have to adapt. If capitalism is the only effective system that we have, then we've certainly got to do a better job of applying it and overseeing it and running it in a more enlightened way for a world that is changing in such a radical way as I've just been talking about. Above all, it is surely true that we have to find a capitalism that serves everyone and not just the rich, and serves the world and not just the West. It is clear, as I started out by saying, that public trust has broken down in not only the institutions, but in some ways the system as a whole. People rightly feel that all too many businesses lost touch with reality. Or to put it differently, that the real job of Adam Smith's invisible hand was to pick their pockets. Today, nearly 70% of people around the world, so surveys rather depressingly tell us, expect businesses in general and financial companies in particular to return to business as usual once the recession and its aftermath ends. That is not an encouraging thought. But it is perhaps the logical reaction to a system which did seem to have lost its principles and its sense of purpose. However, I'm not a pessimist, I'm an optimist. The view championed by Milton Friedman famously, that the sole job of business is to create profits for shareholders, has proven to be not just morally insufficient, but actually commercially insufficient. In the end, it can't serve the community, the business, or the shareholder because it doesn't provide sustainable business models. And there's growing evidence of this. There is now a growing recognition that sustainable profit and corporate social responsibility are not merely not in conflict, but actually are interdependent. Business simply does have a wider role and a broader responsibility. Again, I'm afraid, Churchill put it rather well. He said, "Some people regard private enterprise as a predatory tiger to be shot. Others look on it as a cow they can milk. Not enough people see it as a healthy horse pulling a sturdy wagon." Somehow in recent years, private enterprise has become unhitched from the wider community that is there to serve, and our challenge, you could say, is to put the two back together. This will require a properly regulated, responsible, enlightened approach to the markets and economic and social development. This does mean striking a balance. Our objective has to be to tame the excesses of the system whilst preserving the dynamism of the market forces which spur economic growth and development. Now, I could spend the rest of the evening and bore you rigid with some of the minutiae of the reform that I think is necessary at the technical level in the financial system. Suffice it to say, just broadly, that I think that the direction of financial reform is, broadly speaking, in the right direction, albeit not complete yet. It's true to say, however, that we're not out of the woods yet, that there's still a lot of uncertainty, there's still a lot of nervousness, there's still a big task of rebalancing the world economy to go through, so we're still in dangerous territory. But an enlightened capitalism sees, this is the broader point, that regulation and economic growth don't have to be in competition, that improved rules and regulations are meaningless if they're not matched by a renewed sense of principles and purpose. And it's getting both those things right that is the big challenge for us all in the next few years. Everyone has a role to play in this, not least those of us in the corporate environment, where the responsibility lies first and foremost, of course, in boardrooms. Boards have to attend to the purpose of their company, the values with which it carries out its business, and thus maximize shareholder value over the long term on a sustainable basis. To put it more bluntly, they do have to ask themselves the question and satisfactorily answer it: what is the purpose of the business that we do? In the 21st century, every company should be able to answer the question, how does the business we do contribute to the common good? Banks should be able to assess whether their financial services do or do not contribute to economic and social development. We all have to discover the place of values and responsibility. In that way, it will be possible, and we have to do this because it's essential, to use the power of the free markets, free trade and economic growth to tackle the major problems that the world faces. It's a large agenda. It's a large agenda, as is obvious when you start to think about some of the continuing issues the world faces under two particular headings. The first of them is the issue of poverty and development. Adam Smith argued that no society, quotes, can surely be flourishing and happy where so many of its members remain poor and miserable. I think that sentiment in this day and age has to be applied not just at the level of one particular society or even one nation, but indeed to the entire human race, and that's our challenge. Last month, the United Nations Millennium Development Goals Summit convened here in this city, marking 10 years since world leaders pledged action to transform the lives of the world's poor by 2015, which is, of course, now only 5 years away. And when you look at the scorecard, you'd have to say the record's patchy. Some progress has been made. There has been a significant drop in the number of people living in extreme poverty around the world, from the World Bank estimated 1.8 billion in 1990 to 1.4 billion in 2005, which is not only an absolute drop, but of course a considerably bigger drop as a percentage of the world's population over that time. Nevertheless, we're still clearly a long way off the main goal of reducing the global poverty figure by half. And it doesn't look like we're going to achieve it within that 5-year time frame that's left. Now, we know that the most rapid economic progress comes through free market reform. We know that from all sorts of sources. There was a famous and defining study in the 1990s by Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner, which showed that developing countries with open economies doubled in size, according to their calculations then, about every 16 years. Actually, since then, that has probably shortened. In closed economies, on the other hand, they calculated that progress would be better measured in many decades or even centuries. Nothing that's happened since has changed the main force of that conclusion. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in South Korea. And by the way, next week I'm going to be back in South Korea because of the G20 summit. And it's a graphic example of that point. South Korea has transformed itself over the last 50 years from a struggling, poor, peripheral economy into a global player in just, effectively, 1 to 2 generations. And if you want to see what the contrast is like, anybody who's been to North Korea knows. For other success stories, we don't have to look hard, of course. And the one that gets talked about most, or the two that get talked about most, I suppose, are China and India. In China, radical reforms opened up the economy. Only a generation ago, in the 1970s, was this process started. It has led to phenomenal rates of growth that have now been sustained over quite considerable periods of time. Between 1981 and 2005, China lifted some 600 million people out of measurable poverty. Surely no other force has ever proved so effective on such a scale in transforming people's lives so quickly and for the better. To say that not everything is perfect is obvious. To deny what has been achieved is just nonsense. Could African countries now be beginning to follow the same path? Certainly the continent is more stable than it was perhaps in any time in living memory. The Boston Consulting Group has argued that the African economy as a whole is much more vibrant and entrepreneurial than most people understand. They identified some 40 so-called African challengers, fast-growing, globalizing companies from the financial services sector to mining, from telecoms to airlines, which they think will lead Africa's economic awakening over the next couple of decades. In general, what is interesting is that the financial crisis has not stopped the process of economic development at a pretty rapid rate, particularly in Asia and actually the Middle East. And even Africa, though it was impacted, is still showing growth momentum. Indeed, the crisis has strengthened flows of trade and investment between developing countries, whereas previously so much of it was between developed countries and developing countries. China, India and Brazil investing, for example, in Africa. It seems as though Africa is open for business in a way that has not been true for a long time. Once again, there are many imperfections in what is going on. It is easy to pick holes in it, but I think it is worth not losing sight of a broader picture of optimism which may be there and warranted for the first time for a generation. That's one of the big challenges, the elimination, the gradual eradication of world poverty. Another is, of course, the whole issue of the impact of what is all of that is happening on the world's environment and on climate. Actually, this is an area too where I think an enlightened, market-driven capitalism can and must indeed make a significant contribution if we are to leave the planet in a fit state for our grandchildren. We need to be reminded that we can't continue to use our environment in a way that takes no account of tomorrow. Mark Twain's, actually, I'm sorry, it's not Mark Twain, it's Groucho Marx. Why should I do anything for posterity? Posterity has never done anything for me, is a watchword that's been uncomfortably characteristic of the way we have treated the planet through much of our lifetimes. I'm at that stage of life when I do have grandchildren. They're all under the age of 8. They all, on current life expectancy, have a 50-50 chance of living to see the next century. And I look at them and think it's them who are going to live with the issues arising from the way we treat the planet now. And it concentrates the mind, of course. This is not a new problem, as we all know. The US lived through it in the 1930s with the Dust Bowl. Unsustainable farming practices, removing prairie grasses, which had kept the soil in place and had trapped moisture. And we know what happened. A simple case of agricultural mismanagement leading to economic and social tragedy. You could argue that what's happening now on a global scale is precisely that sort of approach to the environment writ very large. Climate change, brought on by a combination of demographic growth and economic development, is the greatest threat that we face. And the all-embracing theme, really, of resource shortage. Without corrective action, climate change will reduce food grain production in the G20 countries over the next 10 years, with inevitable knock-on effects on pricing. There is now, therefore, an urgent global need to shift to a low-carbon, sustainable economic growth model and away from the high-carbon growth pattern that we have known since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. This is a technical matter and a complex one at that. I'm not an expert. I'm not going to dwell on the intricacies of how do you bring a market discipline, a market approach to the whole issue of allocation of resources and a proper pricing of scarce resources. There's a whole debate on carbon taxes versus carbon pricing. Do you need either of them? Are they enforceable? Etc., etc. What I am confident enough of is the power of the market when it's the servant of humanity properly unleashed to deliver the right pricing and development signals to address this challenge. And indeed, I'm confident of the converse. If we don't find a way of using the market constructively to meet this challenge, we will fail to meet it. How is the market going to work? In all sorts of ways, through rationing, through resource reallocation. It will, for example, finance a wave of startups, technological innovations, big-ticket infrastructure projects, all of which need the financial support and all of which we will need globally in order to get to that low-carbon growth path. It's already the case, interestingly, that quite a lot is happening. What you might describe as the climate business sector, that is to say, the products and services linked to addressing climate change, generate annual revenues, you may not believe this, of around $500 billion. This is already a significant industry, larger actually than the global aerospace industry. And the trend will clearly continue quite rapidly over the next decade. Some estimates put the revenues as high as $2 trillion in as little as 10 years' time. Whether or not that kind of estimate is right is not really the point. The direction is clear. And the need to find huge amounts of capital to invest in the low-carbon growth path is, I think, incontrovertible. I do believe that the capitalist system can rise to this challenge with appropriate governmental policy in place, of course. Indeed, there are some encouraging early signs, I repeat, early signs, but nevertheless, they're there, of what you might call a low-carbon consciousness beginning to permeate investment policy in the capital markets, with all of the potential that this will have over time for cutting carbon emissions from growth. So I've talked about the issue of poverty and development. I've talked about the issue of resource shortage and climate change. But I can't leave the subject of the challenge that we all face collectively without focusing on some of the other kinds of questions that the financial crisis has thrown up through the issue of asking questions about purpose. And those questions have to do with the role of individuals. To deliver on this promise of tackling such major global issues, we do need the kind of reimagined approach to capitalism that I've been arguing for. One that eschews fleeting short-term gains in favor of building sustainable profitability and prosperity for the longer term. But in the light of this need for a fundamental shift in the way the system works, what does this require of the actors within it? We need to ask, what does this mean for us as individuals? What role do we as individuals have in all of this? Are we playing our part in creating the world we want to see? Now, I think that everyone engaged in the sphere of banking and finance has a profound responsibility to carefully consider exactly these questions for obvious reasons. It is clear, for example, that the principal deficiencies in the run-up to the crisis related to patterns of behavior and culture rather than to failures of organizational structure. Indeed, it's worth saying, I think, that however many new regulations or compliance and accountancy rules we introduce, they will never be sufficient. They may be necessary, they will never be sufficient if there is no value system underpinning the decisions that individuals make in their work and career lives. I think it's fair to acknowledge that in some institutions and amongst many individuals, and indeed more broadly through society, the culture had become dangerously one that sort of said to itself, if I've got a product and the market will wear it, and I've got a contract and it's legal, I don't need to ask any other questions. That's my summary definition of market fundamentalism. At its simplest level, individuals had lost sight of the need for integrity and to do business with trust and honesty and fairness. More fundamentally, perhaps, they had lost the ability or the willingness to ask the question, how does the work I do contribute to the common good? Each of us, when we think about it, I hope, applies values to our daily lives outside of the workspace. How come we allowed our lives to be compartmentalized in a way that stopped us asking those questions about our work lives as well? Now, I think there's some basis for optimism in this. There's plenty of basis for cynicism too, but I think there's a basis for optimism because what I believe to be true is that the vast majority of people in the workspace, including, I may say, since I work in a bank, the vast majority of people who work in banks want to feel that they're making a contribution through the work they do and the business they're in. There are very few people for whom money or power really is the be-all and end-all. It is, if you will, a question of developing and sharing and nurturing a set of clear common values which each business can make a credible claim to. And of course it's a challenge, but it's one that has to be risen to. I believe it's the central task of any board to ask this question and to answer it and to provide leadership on it, so that, if you will, the organisation within which people work is no longer simply a collection of employees there for the pay, but a group of engaged citizens. Is this new, or is this an older principle of ancient wisdom? I actually think it's the latter and not the former. I'm encouraged in that thought by one very remarkable person who used to work for the company that I now work for 100 years ago. His name was Charles Addis. He was our man in Beijing about 100 years ago. He was a man who didn't marry, and he wrote a lot of letters home to his sister in England. And those letters have been preserved. And he was a clearly very thoughtful, interesting, intellectual person who took a lot of interest in what was going on around him. And he wrote in one particular letter, quite simply, that the ultimate basis of all economic conceptions is ethical. He was right. Much has changed since then, of course. Much has changed in the way we express things and think about things, of course, since then. He wrote in florid Victorian language. We write differently. But the basic point was surely right. Famously, of course, Harvard Business School has introduced an ethics oath for its MBA students, one line of which reads, "I will seek a course that enhances the value my enterprise can create for society over the long term." Great minds think alike. I realize that this kind of thought attracts a range of reactions, including a fair amount of cynicism, but actually, if you don't start that way, how on earth will you ever get into the right space? And it's terrific, actually, that the leaders of the future, the business leaders of the future, are being asked to consider the wider ramifications and the overall purpose of what it is they do with what is, let's face it, probably 90% of their creative and energy and potential of their lives. They're being asked to commit to ensuring that responsibility, sustainability, and accountability run through their business decisions. The world is becoming wealthier, and yet it doesn't often feel that way. Demographics and development, in the short term at least, bring more competition for resources and greater inequality. Globalization can break down barriers between cultures and increase tolerance and understanding, but it can also swell feelings of injustice, anger, and even fundamentalism. In a more uncertain world, therefore, people look for certainty wherever they can find it, whether they find it in religion or in markets or even in the wisdom of founding fathers. But I think that there are some optimistic signs to build on. I do think that Harvard Oath is one example of the point. The great danger is, of course, that we withdraw and become compartmentalized in the face of the complexity of the challenges and the risks. Completeness in our lives and our ability to work towards a better future will, however, rest on our ability to do the opposite. We have to be willing to accept and embrace the ambiguities of a modern world, and at their best, both businesses and faith communities can help us to do this and cut across the boundaries and bring us all closer together in a globalizing planet. And we should take solace in the fact that these feelings are not new. Think, for example, of the old Breton fisherman's prayer that President Kennedy used to have on his desk in the Oval Office, which reflects the fear and uncertainty and the immensity of the challenges. "O God, thy sea is so great and my boat is so small." And yet, there are signs and a basis for some hope. We all view the world through a prism made up of our values, our experiences, and our faith, whatever that may be. It is through these prisms that we interpret the world and our place within it. And so, of course, we have different perspectives, and yet the fact is, and here again is the basis for the optimism, I believe, that despite the many cultural differences that we become increasingly aware of in a globalizing world, many of our key values about what counts as a human being, what makes us happy, what makes us fulfilled, are shared across religions, across borders, across races, across generations. As human beings, we do actually have a remarkable amount in common. There is a remarkable consensus about what is really important to life and what is, if you will, right. Certainly, as far as our encounters in the world of trade and commerce and business and the marketplace is concerned. Certainly, as far as our encounters in cultural exchange are concerned. This simple truth has, in my view, to guide our actions in business. The knowledge that though it is hard to see, the common good is nothing more or less than the decisions that we make collectively as individuals. The challenge is to perceive that bigger picture and to focus on our responsibility vis-à-vis that common good. As I conclude, I just want to reflect on the experience that led me to start trying to draw these thoughts together into that book that Ron kindly referred to. I found myself in April 2008 sitting in a financial conference in rather elegant surroundings in Lake Como in Italy. After that, and by the way, that conference was taking place just as the early rumblings of the financial crisis were becoming more and more audible, and people were nervous and anxious about what would happen. The result proved to be even worse than what the doomsayers were saying. After that conference, I went down to Milan, not very far away, and I visited that most extraordinary building that I hope many of you will have visited, Milan's Cathedral. It is one of the largest and most beautiful churches in the world. It's an incredible sight. It is remarkable to reflect on the circumstances in which it got built. The foundation stone was laid in the year of the Black Death. Think about that. An experience which probably reduced the population of Europe at the time by about a third. The building took some 400 years to complete. Those who started it didn't know exactly what it was going to look like when it was finished, or when, or indeed if it would be finished. And I think that building is a kind of metaphor for the challenge we face now. The world is full of those sorts of uncertainties that I've been talking about. The future is particularly nerve-wracking at the moment. It's surely an act of pure faith to say that, nevertheless, we're going to lay foundation stones. And we're going to go on with the building, even though we won't be the ones that see it completed. Because surely that's the metaphor for the only satisfactory approach to a really fulfilled life in the business world and in the markets. If we can do that, then I am sure that we will see that a kind of faith vision and a market responsibility, so far from being incompatible, actually go hand in hand and are the recipe for a really fulfilled life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's wonderful to hear your voice, which is in some ways audible in the book as well, to hear it in this setting. I want to press a little bit, and how we're going to proceed here is we'll have a bit of a conversation, and then toward the end of our time, open it up for some audience questions. I want to press a little bit on the ethical responsibility, commitment to the common good question. And I'd like to draw you out with a little bit more detail or specificity on two questions. One, how does one go about changing the culture of an organization? You talked about the role that government regulation can play. You talked about the importance of values of individuals. But if you have to transform the culture of a business organization toward the kinds of ideals that you set before us, how does one go about doing that? And how does one aspire toward creating a critical mass of such organizations committed to the common good? That's the first. The second is to ask if you could be any more detailed about the role that religious communities might play in this overall vision, because you made very brief reference to it at the end. And yet I'm wondering whether you have some more concrete notions of how the multiplicity of religious traditions and institutions can help move toward these ideals.
Well, thank you. Both important questions, and let me take a crack at doing it.
Okay.
I mean, on the first one, firstly, I think if you work in an institution where you inherit a constructive, good corporate culture, then I think there is no more important responsibility, and I think it does lie in the first instance at board level, but clearly doesn't stop there. There's no more important responsibility than to nurture that, refresh it, and pass it on. Now, I am in the lucky position that I work in a company which I do think has a reasonably good corporate culture. I say reasonably good because I think it's also important to remind ourselves and anybody involved in this debate that nothing is perfect. I mean, one of the, I think, extraordinarily powerful instincts, particularly of a Christian perspective, is that all human beings are shot through with imperfection. All institutions are shot through with imperfection, and that goes for businesses and governments and NGOs and churches even, dare I say that, and so forth. So, and it's clearly true of us all as individuals. So the most you can say is that we set the right goals and will constantly be conscious of falling short. I mean, that's the kind of condition of life, and you have to accept that. Nevertheless, I do have the good fortune to be working in a company where I think this has been taken seriously for some time. I do think that the task of creating a good corporate culture in an institution which, for whatever reasons of past history, it doesn't exist, is a very hard one. But how do you do it, and how do you refresh it and nurture it if you start with a good inheritance? I do think the board, I think boards should have a formal session on this once a year, for example. I mean, the way we do it, but I don't think any great secrets of this or any great, many other companies do too. We have an annual board strategic offsite, and one of the items in that is a session on the corporate culture, the values, and the brand. And it's worth dwelling on that for 1 second, because I think what company brands are things which are talked about and focused on and written a lot about in business school textbooks. And it's important to see the brand as not just a logo. This is not just an advertising slogan or a logo or a set of colors or whatever. The brand is a concept that at its best embodies the essence of the company, both externally and internally, and is perceived as such, both externally and internally. And if that's out of joint with what you mean the company to be, then you've got an issue that you need to address. So you asked for specificity, looking at the brand, the values, and doing kind of external consultancy work on what the values are, not merely what does the board say they are, but what do people through the company around the world think they are, and assessing that at board level in formal discussion at a strategic offsite is one part of the answer. It goes, of course, beyond that, because this has to foliate through the organization. We are a company that employs 300,000 people in 88 countries, every conceivable community around the world that you can imagine. It is part of the task of senior management, part of the thing I find myself saying constantly, is that actually leadership is not something just confined to the board or to the senior management. Leadership is something that every single one of those 300,000 people, in our case, has a responsibility for. Because everybody is a leader, at least in this sense, that no matter how many or few people you have reporting to you on an organization chart, you have the opportunity to influence people around you, inside or outside the company, for good or for ill, and therefore you have a leadership responsibility. Refreshing that, nurturing it, rewarding it, meaning I don't mean monetary reward, I mean all kinds of affirmation, encouragement. This is all part of the task of good management as I would conceive it.
Second question was the role of religious institutions or religious communities in a religiously diverse world.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is a religiously diverse world, and as we globalize, we become more and more conscious of how religiously diverse the world is. I think, and again, I do work in a company that's got every single religion you can imagine represented in it, as well as its, no doubt, its fair share of humanists, atheists, agnostics, and all through the company. And it's clearly in a culturally diverse world, not the responsibility of anybody, particularly those who are in senior management positions, to abuse their position by using it to promote any particular religious perspective. I do think you have to be prepared to give an account of what you stand for, which is a different thing. But I do think that the official religious institutions can and do play a potentially interesting role in this. One of the things that's happened, I can't speak for New York because I don't live and work here. I can speak for London where I do live and work. One of the things that has happened in the last 2 or 3 years is a quite active involvement of both the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church in particular in sponsoring conferences, for example, of senior leaders in the City of London to sit round a table for a morning and talk specifically about what went wrong, what are the lessons to be learned about values and so on. So absolutely, I think there's a part to play. In the Muslim world, the whole interest in Islamic banking and how that derives from Quranic principles, where there's a real sense of fairness between the two parties to a contract that underlies that, I think there's a lot to learn from that too. So, and then you have a kind of Buddhist, and I could go on.
Right.
In short, I definitely think that writing, speaking, engagement by official religious institutions has a part to play.
I want to follow up a little bit again on the ethical responsibility question and its relationship to religion and religious practice. You seem confident that there is a genuine overlap in the fundamental values that religious communities bring to the questions that you've laid out here in terms of markets.
I think that's a very... sorry.
Please, no, go ahead.
But I did say that.
Yeah.
And I am conscious that if you take the issue, you take the human issues about which philosophical, moral, religious discussion takes place, it is clear that there are some areas of obvious difference of view. It is absolutely not the case that there is a set of universally recognized values around all cultures and communities. Plainly not. Just to take just one example simply to make the point, extremely controversial, the issue about abortion. However, what I do think is true is that when you look at those ethics that arise or are engaged in the question of what makes for fair trading, good exchange, profitable business and commerce at that level, then I think what is surprising when you think about it is how much agreement there really is there across a very wide range of communities. It is absolutely not saying, and that therefore everybody is engaged in business for kind of good, sound, moral reasons. There are plenty of people who say, yes, I know what's right, and bother that, I'm going for what is my own interest. But you don't find too many people who will dispute the notion that, for example, a contract is a contract is a contract, just by way of example.
Mm-hmm. In the latter part of your most recent book, your account of global poverty has an element of pathos that didn't necessarily come through with the statistical analysis that you gave this evening. But it's clear that you feel deeply about the problem of poverty, as well as feeling confident that there may be means in place or that we can put into place to start alleviating it. So I guess I'm encouraging you to say a little bit more about the profound human cost of poverty and how that figures into the ideals that you've set before us this evening.
Well, you're right. I tell a couple of stories in the book that I've had the great privilege of being involved in. And I suppose what I should say is that given the job I do, I travel a lot. And the travel gives you the privilege, the opportunity of seeing all sorts of things. And again, I work in many large companies these days have active programs of community engagement of one sort or another, and we're no exception. And I've tried, when I have the opportunity, to go see some of the projects we support. And you see the most amazing people doing the most amazing things. And there's nothing like seeing real people doing real things in extraordinarily difficult circumstances to get behind the statistics. And it's kind of that you'd have to have a heart of stone not to be moved by some of the things you see. And I'm very lucky to have the opportunity of seeing that. and I see very little of it. I have a friend who was in my office in London day before yesterday, who is actually the new chief executive of Christian Aid in the UK. And she came out of the financial services and has undergone a significant career change by moving out of that into becoming the director of Christian Aid. And she said, she'd been in a particular situation in Uganda, it in fact was, and she'd seen things with her own eyes, and as she put it, there simply is no substitute for seeing it for yourself to suddenly realize the human cost that we're talking about. These aren't statistics. There's a very powerful ad campaign that was actually run by another, again, forgive me for talking about a British context, but that's what I'm familiar with, another British Christian charity, as it happens, raising funds for development work in developing countries. And they had a wonderfully powerful TV advertisement, which effectively took an individual girl from Uganda again, aged in her teens. Parents have both died of, I'm afraid it's a story that we're all too familiar with, at least at the level of statistics. Her parents had died of age. She's raising several siblings. Life is hard, and she's intelligent and actually quite well educated, and so she's able to articulate the challenge. And she talks through this in a very matter-of-fact way, and then right at the end, with an almost breaking voice, she says, "But I miss my mum and dad." And it cuts at that point.
And as you think then, and this will be my last question, and we'll open it up soon, as you think then, both about that sort of person, but just the ordinary worker, my parents coming from a working class background, as you talk about the sources of hope, and you talk about the role that leadership can play, whether it's at the board or leadership all down through an organization, what has to happen? What do we have to communicate to ordinary citizens that there is reason to hope, to start moving or pushing back against the forms of anger and cynicism that seem so understandably rampant today?
Well, I think hope is at the end of the day an act of faith. I don't think you can prove there are reasons to hope. What we can do, and we all know it's true, is we can assert that the world has enough technological resources now and enough stock of capital resources to cure the world's problems. We know how to get the world to a low-carbon growth path. We know how to alleviate poverty, technically. Mm-hmm. So you can at least say this is not the art of the impossible, it is the art of the possible technically, and that the reasons why it doesn't happen are deeply embedded in the way humans operate, the way the extent of the breadth of their interests, their ability to agree compromises, and therefore the challenge is about human ability to work together and human willpower, whether it's at the political level or the company level or the individual level. It's not about the availability of the technical means to do it. So that at least in that sense you can say there's a basis for hope. But beyond that, the real truth is hope's an act of faith. There's plenty of reason to be cynical or despairing.
So the challenge is as much spiritual as material.
Yeah.
Interesting. We have time for a few other questions. There are microphones here in the center, and if you would go to those microphones, then I will acknowledge the questioners. Please.
Thanks for a fascinating presentation. You talked very nicely about the role about capitalism, and within capitalism, the role of businesses and the questions that businesses have to ask themselves, and the role of individuals and the questions individuals have to ask themselves. There's one piece that seems to be missing in large chunks of the economy, that in between businesses and individuals, you have organized labor, labor unions. Do you see any roles for them? I mean, we know about the period of Charles Dickens, but going forward, what questions do you think that they should ask themselves, and what role do you see them playing?
Thank you.
I think that's a very important point. I mean, there's historically, organized labor has played an extremely important part in spreading the benefits of capital, making capitalism behave itself, would be one way of putting it. And any student of the history of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century would have to salute the way some very brave people orchestrated labor power to achieve a more just distribution of resources. And I think there are many countries in the world today where, well, I suspect that in every country in the world today, organized labor has a role to play. What is clear is that the role of organized labor needs to change as economies change, and you've seen in all of the developed economies quite significant changes in the way in which labor interests are represented. You can also, of course, again in rich countries, point to situations now where organized institutions of that kind are being used to bolster entirely unjustified privileges and positions in the world at large that don't have any reasonable justification. So I think it's a hard question to answer in general, except that your point is well taken, that we mustn't overlook the importance in a real imperfect world that we live in of ensuring that there is proper representation of the interests of groups of people who will otherwise get divided and exploited by some of the misbehaviors of the capitalist system.
Hi. My name is Erol Lushenko. I'm from Kiev, Ukraine. I'm a lawyer and a co-founder of the Harvard Club of Ukraine. And first of all, thank you for the great and insightful presentation. Secondly, I'm very sorry for not having a quote from the Winston Churchill, but I have a quote from JFK which I like. Don't ask for easier lives, ask for stronger men. And Warren Buffett, in my opinion, is one of those strong men. Warren Buffett had said that derivatives are weapons of mass destruction. So do you believe, that's his quote, do you believe that derivatives should be eliminated, restricted, or just left alone for the markets to regulate? And a bigger question about the future of the European Union and the euro. As you know, there is no monetary union in the history of the world which survived without a single state. How do you comment on this? Do you think euro has future? Thank you.
There you go. So, two small questions. No, I don't believe that derivatives are a weapon of mass destruction. No, I don't believe they can be left to be self-regulating. I do think they've got an obvious useful purpose in the markets, and you can't, and nor does Warren Buffett really think that you can do without them. But they do need to be regulated, and if you take an interest in the topic, you'll be aware that the current regulatory pressure is to get more of them cleared through exchanges so that they're more transparent, and that feels like a good idea because it reduces systemic risk. So the short answer is they've got an important part to play. They need to be properly overseen and regulated. On the euro and the European Union, indeed, that's a whole evening in itself. I am a European. I live in a European country. It happens to be one that's not a member of the Eurozone, but it is a member of the European Union. I absolutely believe the European Union has a stable, long-term future. And I think what they're doing is creating a human, corporate, social, political structure which actually doesn't have any precedence in the world. You're right. There's no, well, I think there are some small examples of monetary unions that don't have political union. Indeed, there are certainly some. But there are countries that use the dollar without being politically part of the United States. So there certainly are. There are no examples of a group of major countries coming together for a major world currency like the euro. But I believe it will succeed, actually, not least because it's extremely technically difficult to break it up, which is, I could spend the rest of the evening on this topic if you want to. But the broader thing that I'm interested in as a European is that I think the European Union as a project is its own worst advertisement. The Europeans constantly grumble about the complexities, the bureaucracy, the chaos, the absence of cohesive international or supranational agendas, etc. And that's all true. But my view is that the right metaphor for the European Union is a bit like the cathedral I was talking about. They've laid the foundation stone. The final appearance of the European Union will not be revealed in our lifetimes. It probably will take a couple of hundred years to develop as a phenomenon, but it'll be there.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on your new appointment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Aaron Bird, I'm a current student at Harvard Divinity School. Always wanted to be a Christian minister, so very much appreciate your book and all of your work because I have always wanted to invade my business aspirations with Christianity and my faith. I have two experiences, and I would like your feedback on the first. I spent 4 years prior to returning to Harvard Divinity School in a CDO originations group in New York.
They might be weapons of mass destruction.
And post the Divinity School, I plan to return to a private equity position, maybe in an emerging market kind of setting. Spent the last 2 summers in East Africa working in private equity. My question is, I think the latter situation, emerging market, developmental investments, it's probably relatively pretty conversation for you to have with some of your employees regarding being able to envision how their work is meaningful. In regards to maybe some of the structured product positions within your bank, back to Professor Thieman's original question, what does that detailed conversation look like? How do you help those employees envision how their role within your firm is connected to a greater common good?
Well, take the first part of it. What is clearly true is that the financial services industry in the go-go years in the run-up to about 07, 08 was producing all sorts of extremely complex products which nobody properly understood and which was being bought by investors who were chasing yield without any reference to risk. And that is socially, to use a phrase used by the British regulator but echoed at this side of the Atlantic as well, socially useless. And the industry owes the wider community an apology for having allowed that to develop. The regulators owe the community a wider apology for not having controlled it, because they had a job to do and they fell down on the job. Nevertheless, the important thing is to learn from that. I do not, I rather flippantly said just now that CDOs are a weapon of mass destruction. I think some CDOs were. CDOs per se aren't. Much of the market product development of the last 10 to 15 years, in its basic sense, has a perfectly obvious socially useful role as part of broader markets. What happened was it got too complex, for one thing, too geared, for another, and too short-termist in its approach to profit-making. And the result was something we all know about. And there is a sobriety that we need in the marketplace, which we have all got to recognize. And those of us who are in the industry need to own up and say, yeah, this wasn't right. It's not the same thing as saying all of it was wrong. It's not the same thing as saying every person who was engaged in banks, including in wholesale banking, was up to no good. But there were enough people who disgraced the industry for this to have left the industry tarnished in the wider public mind. And that's a sad thing. And we've got to put it right, because you cannot do without the markets if you want sustainable economic and social development at the global level. So we have to put it right. I also think that same thought leads to the proposition that it's entirely reasonable for somebody like yourself, who's been in it and has now gone to a divinity school and is contemplating going back to it, to exactly do that. I.e., there should be no sense that anybody should have that there's something intrinsically incompatible between a Christian faith or any other faith and working in the markets. I absolutely believe that it's entirely possible to approach this in a way that reconciles a faith commitment with the business you do. Indeed, that's the whole thrust of what I was saying. That it carries challenges with it is for sure. That it involves owning up to things that weren't right, that's for sure. But that, of course, is also a wider Christian point, is it not? We all have things we have to own up to and things we should regret and acknowledge and seek to be redeemed from, because that's part of human experience.
My name is Manish Kapoor. I'm a simple peasant in capital markets. Never went to Harvard Divinity School. But my question was based more on the book you had written a few years ago, where you talked a lot about the nature of human temptation and how people don't understand it, and the Faustian bargain being the archetype of humanity. I sometimes feel that it's clear to us what were the temptations which led us astray for this crisis, but temptations and incentives change over time. And if you could talk a little bit more about how you would try and preempt that, especially in terms of finance, where there is a line between what you hinted at earlier, between what is legal but not necessarily legitimate or moral.
You're right. The Faustian bargain, let me just talk for 1 second about that and then answer the question, because I think the story of Faust, which I do major on, actually both, but particularly in this latter book, is, I think, a very telling one for our times. this is, as I'm sure you all know, the story of the man who sells his soul to the devil in return for 24 years of unadulterated pleasure. And in the original Christopher Marlowe play, you see him going on a sort of rumbustious rampage through life, having sold his soul, and then the awful end comes. There is Goethe's Faust, which is a much subtler treatment of the theme, in which it's not a deal where he sold his soul, it's a contract that says, if you can give me one moment of undiluted pleasure, you can have my soul. It's a very subtle but a very important difference in the story. And then the whole of that story is about, and it's an ambiguous, deliberately ambiguous play about whether in fact the devil succeeds in delivering this one moment of undiluted pleasure or not. And you're left at the end of it uncertain as to what the outcome is. It is one of the world's greatest pieces of literature. If you've never studied it, please do so. Not merely because it's one of the world's greatest pieces of literature, but also because it's very telling to the human condition, I think, in all cultures, in all ages. The notion that you give too much to something, or in biblical terms, you seek to worship an idol. You give, to use a Shakespearean phrase, your be-all and end-all to something. That comes from Macbeth, but it's a phrase that's entered into the English language. And we do this, or risk doing this so often, in business, in politics, and in other realms of life too, come to that, but clearly in business. And we end up laying too much of ourselves on the altar of more profit, more money, more power, or whatever it might be. The Faust myth is a telling and an insistent reminder of the danger, the spiritual danger of doing that. Now, what are the practical things you can do, in particularly in the financial services area, to deal particularly with the sorts of issues that the last question was talking about, the misbehavior? Well, I think there are things that you can do. First of all, there is a responsibility for regulators to set limits, set either regulatory or even legal limits to what is done. There is a responsibility on boards. I mean, for instance, to go back to the point about complex products, why were the complex products which the in some cases, the risk management function of the company itself couldn't understand, why were those being sold? And so you can put in simple decision rules. You know, if you, the risk management function, don't understand it, don't let it be sold. You can also deal with compensation practices. And indeed, actually, speaking for the European context now for a moment, because that I'm more familiar with, the regulators have now imposed quite detailed rules on how compensation can be paid, basically in order to term out packages of compensation in a way that aligns the risk, aligns the reward to the trader with the risk that's left on the books of the company, and therefore the wider risk of the shareholder, to align that more closely. Some of the things that were going wrong in the earlier years of this decade were, for example, the fact that you'd have these complex products, they're left on the books of the company, and even if they're sold on, there's a kind of residual put back to the company for reputational reasons. The profit on day one is very considerable. The risk and the damage comes over the succeeding years, yet the day one, the trader has been paid his bonus on the basis of that day one profit. Now, under European rules, you can't do that. And so there are things you can do to minimize the risk of somebody going crazy with the bank's capital and its reputation. And those are important and they must be in place. But to go back to a point that I was making, I think the rules are always necessary. They will never be sufficient. They are never a substitute for responsible leadership by boards in particular, which foliates through the company, which has to do with making sure you understand what the purpose of the business is, how it contributes to the common good. Yes, of course, it's got to be profitable. Banks and other businesses are not charities. They're not-for-profit organization. They do handle risk capital. They have to give a return. So it must be profitable, but that profitability has to be understood as a sustainable long-term profitability. And in that context, boards have got a very clear responsibility.
One of the consequences of finitude is that time runs out, and I'm afraid we are to that moment where we have obligations both to the club and to others to bring this to an end, even though there are many questions, I'm sure significant ones, to be asked. But let us end it with yet another statement of our gratitude for your time and effort here. Thank you. Well done. And thank you as well. Well done, thank you.